Have you ever watched a late-night interview and suddenly realized you weren't just watching a celebrity promote a movie? You were witnessing the moment an artist revealed the weight of an impossible dream? For a few unforgettable minutes, the laughter faded, the applause softened, and the studio transformed into something that felt far more personal. Every answer carried the gravity of years of preparation. Every pause hinted at sacrifices the audience could barely imagine. And when Christopher Nolan sat across from Stephen Colbert to discuss the Odyssey, it became clear this wasn't simply another Hollywood conversation. It felt like the beginning of a cinematic legend unfolding in real time. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, make sure you subscribe to The Truth Narrator, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments, what's your favorite Christopher Nolan film? Your support helps us bring you more dramatic stories from the biggest moments in entertainment. The lights inside the studio glowed warmly as Stephen Colbert welcomed his guests with a familiar confidence audiences had come to expect. The crowd erupted into applause. Christopher Nolan smiled politely, acknowledging the audience with a humble wave before taking his seat. Calm on the outside, composed as always, but behind that calm expression seemed to be the mind of a filmmaker carrying the responsibility of creating something far greater than another blockbuster. Stephen leaned forward with curiosity. So, Christopher, after everything you've accomplished, why the Odyssey? A brief silence settled over the room. Nolan smiled faintly. Because some stories, he replied, never stopped speaking to us. The audience grew unusually quiet. Instead of launching into a typical promotional answer, Nolan began describing how Homer's ancient tale had fascinated him for years. He explained that this wasn't simply about adapting an old poem. To him, it represented one of humanity's first great adventures, a story about courage, loss, identity, and the painful journey home. Stephen nodded thoughtfully. But that's an enormous responsibility. It is, Nolan admitted, and that's exactly why it deserves to be attempted. The audience applauded. Stephen couldn't hide his admiration. You've made films that change how audiences think about science fiction, time, war, memory. But mythology. Nolan laughed softly. Modern superheroes owe a tremendous debt to ancient myths. We've simply changed the costumes. The audience laughed. But the emotional questions, Nolan continued, they're exactly the same. Something shifted inside the studio. This was no longer an interview. It felt like two storytellers discussing why stories themselves matter. Stephen leaned even closer. Did you ever worry that audiences wouldn't connect with a 3,000-year-old epic? Nolan answered almost immediately. No. Another pause. Because people haven't changed as much as we think. The audience murmured in agreement. We still fear losing our families. We still chase impossible dreams. We still wonder who we become after surviving extraordinary experiences. Those words hung in the air. Stephen looked toward the audience before turning back. So you're saying this isn't really about ancient Greece? Nolan smiled. It's about all of us. The applause arrived again, louder this time. Stephen wasn't finished. This production sounds absolutely massive. Nolan nodded. It has to be. You've insisted on practical effects again. As much as possible. Stephen raised an eyebrow. In an era where computers can create almost anything. Nolan's expression became serious. Technology is an incredible tool. But reality still has something digital images struggle to replace. The audience leaned forward. The unpredictability. You can't program genuine chaos. That sentence seemed to echo through the theater. Stephen smiled knowingly. I imagine that makes filming complicated. Nolan laughed. Extremely. The audience joined him. He began describing the challenges of shooting on real locations, coordinating enormous productions, and pushing filmmaking technology beyond its current limits, not because innovation itself was a goal, but because the story demanded it. Stephen interrupted with a grin. So basically, you're making life as difficult as possible for yourself. More laughter. Nolan shrugged playfully. Probably. But sometimes the hardest road creates the most unforgettable destination. The audience responded with another wave of applause. Yet beneath the humor, something deeper remained visible. This wasn't confidence. It was commitment. As Stephen prepared his next question, viewers could already sense the conversation was heading somewhere unexpected. The biggest revelation had not yet arrived. Stephen Colbert let the applause settle before smiling with a kind of expression that usually came just before an unexpected question. "You've spent years pushing the boundaries of filmmaking," he said. "Every time people think you've reached the limit, you somehow move it again. So tell me, what terrified you most about making the Odyssey?" The audience laughed lightly. Nolan didn't. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "Failure." The word landed with surprising weight. For a moment, even Stephen seemed caught off guard. "You mean box office failure?" Nolan slowly shook his head. "No, the possibility that I might fail the story." The audience fell silent. Stephen nodded slowly. "That's a different kind of pressure." "It is," Nolan replied quietly. "When you're adapting something that survived thousands of years, you realize you're only its temporary caretaker." The room erupted into applause. Stephen smiled. "I don't think many directors would describe themselves that way." Nolan laughed softly. "Maybe they should." Another wave of laughter swept through the audience. Stephen flipped through his notes before looking up again. "I've heard this production has been unlike anything you've ever attempted." Nolan smiled. "That's true. You've worked with enormous casts before." "I have." "You've recreated wars." "Yes." "You've explored space." "Correct." "So what makes this one different?" Nolan paused. "Everything has to feel owned." His voice became more thoughtful. "Audiences today have seen impossible things created by computers. So simply making something bigger isn't enough anymore." Stephen nodded. "You have to make them believe." Exactly. The conversation was no longer about cameras or budgets. It had become a discussion about trust between filmmaker and audience. Stephen leaned forward. "And that's why you insisted on practical filmmaking again." Nolan smiled. "When actors stand inside a real environment, they react differently. They breathe differently. They move differently. You can't fake genuine surprise." The audience applauded. Stephen couldn't resist teasing him. "So your actors don't always know what they're walking into." Laughter echoed through the studio. Nolan grinned. "Sometimes that's intentional." The audience laughed even louder. Stephen raised an eyebrow. "That's either brilliant or slightly terrifying." "Perhaps both." Another round of applause followed. Then Stephen shifted toward the cast. "You assembled an extraordinary group of actors." Nolan nodded proudly. "They've all committed themselves completely." "What impressed me most wasn't talent. It was discipline." Stephen looked intrigued. "What do you mean?" "They were willing to become uncomfortable. They accepted difficult locations, long hours, physical exhaustion, because everyone understood we weren't making spectacle for spectacle's sake. We were chasing authenticity." The audience listened intently. Stephen smiled. "Sounds like nobody had an easy day." Nolan laughed. "I certainly didn't." The laughter returned, but neither did anyone else. Stephen looked toward the audience. "I imagine that creates quite a bond." "It does," Nolan answered. "When everyone struggles together, something changes. You stop feeling like co-workers. You begin feeling like fellow travelers." That phrase lingered in the room. Fellow travelers. As though everyone involved had joined Odysseus on his own impossible voyage. Stephen took a breath. "There's another thing people have been talking about. The technology." The audience immediately responded with curiosity. "I've heard you've been experimenting with entirely new IMAX equipment." Nolan smiled modestly. "We needed cameras capable of doing things that simply weren't possible before." Stephen leaned closer. "So instead of changing your vision to fit existing technology, you changed the technology." The audience applauded before Nolan even answered. "We tried." It required years of collaboration. There were setbacks. There were moments when we honestly weren't sure it could work. Stephen laughed. "That sounds familiar." Nolan smiled knowingly. "It usually does." Stephen shook his head. "Most people hear the word Hollywood and imagine glamour. But listening to you, It sounds more like engineering. Nolan laughed. In many ways, filmmaking is engineering. It's solving hundreds of impossible problems every single day. And tomorrow, you wake up to solve 100 more. The audience applauded again. Stephen looked almost inspired. Do you ever stop worrying? Nolan answered without hesitation. No. The audience laughed. I think worrying means you still care. If I ever stopped worrying, I'd probably stop directing. A hush spread across the theater. Stephen studied Nolan for a moment before quietly asking one final question. When audiences finally sit down to watch the Odyssey, what do you hope they're feeling when the credits roll? Nolan didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward the audience. Then he spoke softly. I hope they remember why stories survive. Not because they are old, but because every generation discovers itself inside them. The audience rose into a standing ovation. Stephen smiled, but there was one surprise still waiting. He glanced toward the giant screen behind them. Well, I think this is a perfect moment. Because for the very first time, we're about to show everyone something they've never seen before. The studio lights dimmed. The massive screen flickered to life. The audience held its breath. And in that instant, the interview transformed into a world-exclusive reveal that would send shockwaves far beyond the walls of the theater. The studio lights faded into darkness, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. The massive screen behind Stephen Colbert and Christopher Nolan flickered to life. A deep orchestral note echoed through the theater as the first breathtaking images of the Odyssey filled the screen. Towering cliffs crashed into violent seas. Ancient ships battled impossible waves. A lone warrior stood at the bow, staring toward an uncertain horizon. The audience didn't cheer. They simply stared. It was a kind of silence filmmakers dream about, the silence that comes when people completely forget where they are. As the trailer reached its emotional climax, the screen faded to black. For 2 seconds. Nothing. Then the entire theater exploded. Thunderous applause shook the studio. Some audience members jumped to their feet. Others looked at one another in disbelief, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Stephen Colbert stood smiling, almost laughing at the overwhelming reaction. I think, he joked as the applause continued, they liked it. The audience laughed while continuing their standing ovation. Nolan smiled politely, but his expression revealed something deeper than satisfaction. It was relief. Years of planning, years of writing, years of impossible production challenges, all had led to this single moment. Stephen turned back toward him. Do moments like this ever get easier? Nolan looked around the cheering audience before quietly answering, No, and I hope they never do. The applause returned, because if it ever feels routine, I probably stopped caring. Those words struck the audience almost as powerfully as the trailer itself. Stephen nodded. That's probably why your films still feel like events. Nolan smiled. I just hope people leave the theater with something to think about. The interview came to a close, but the story was only beginning. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, social media erupted. Clips from the interview spread across every platform. Viewers shared Nolan's thoughtful answers, replayed his comments about mythology, practical filmmaking, and storytelling, while reactions to the trailer poured in faster than anyone could count. Entertainment journalists rushed to publish breaking articles. Film critics began analyzing every frame of the preview. YouTube creators uploaded reaction videos within hours, pausing nearly every shot to search for hidden details and possible clues about the story. Some praised Nolan's ambition. Others debated whether adapting one of history's greatest epics was simply too risky. One headline declared, "The biggest film gamble of the decade." Another called it the next evolution of epic cinema. Fans passionately defended every creative decision, while skeptics questioned whether expectations had become impossibly high. And that was exactly what made the interview unforgettable. It wasn't built on controversy. It wasn't fueled by personal attacks. It wasn't manufactured drama. Instead, it reminded millions of people that the greatest confrontations aren't always between two individuals. Sometimes the real battle is between expectation and ambition, between fear and determination, between playing it safe and attempting something that could redefine an entire generation of filmmaking. Christopher Nolan never raised his voice. He never argued. He never tried to convince anyone that his vision was correct. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He invited the audience to judge the work for themselves. And perhaps that's why the conversation continues long after the cameras stop rolling, long after the applause fades, long after the studio lights go dark. Because every unforgettable story leaves behind one final question. Was this simply another movie promotion? Or did millions of viewers witness the birth of a cinematic journey that will be remembered for decades? Only time will answer that. But one thing is certain. That evening on The Late Show became more than an interview. It became a moment when storytelling itself took center stage, reminding everyone watching that the greatest adventures don't begin on the screen. They begin with someone brave enough to imagine the impossible. Now it's your turn to join the conversation. What was the most powerful moment from Christopher Nolan's interview? And do you think The Odyssey will become one of the greatest epic films ever made? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one of them. And if you enjoyed the cinematic deep dive, don't forget to like this video, share it with your fellow movie fans, and subscribe to The Truth Narrator for more explosive celebrity interviews, unforgettable confrontations, and dramatic stories from the world of entertainment. Until next time, keep questioning, keep watching, and keep discovering the stories behind the headlines.